This video will discuss the dormer windows for the Dollar Store Dollhouse. I started by designing the dormer on the computer. This was one of the trickier components of the construction, since this is composed of multiple pieces and connects to the sloping roof. It has been a while since attending math classes to determine measurements for intersecting planes, but I was able to get by and made adjustments as needed. I created a prototype, then produced the parts for additional dormers. I originally was planning to place 2 dormers on each side of the roof, but wanted to compare this with 3 dormers. I decided that 3 dormers looked more proportional to the house and built some additional dormer components. I set up a sample with shingles, trim, and window frame to better visualize my thoughts. My original design was to have a picture frame on the exterior of the dormer, but I thought this would detract from the shingle detail that I wanted to highlight. I had already cut out the frames, but discarded these after changing my mind. I had some leftover dollhouse shingles that are 1 inch high by 1/2 inch wide. I drew horizontal lines along the front surface of the dormer. The first line is 1 3/8 inches from the bottom, and subsequent lines are spaced 3/4 of an inch apart. The first row of shingles will be flush with the bottom, and subsequent rows are flush with the penciled line. The guidelines are also transferred to the side wings of the dormer. Since the windows will be mounted on the inside of the dormer, like all the other windows, I wanted to finish off the raw edge of the exposed foam. I painted some coffee stirrers with white spray paint. The width of the stir is just slightly wider than the depth of the foam core board. In case there were variations in the window openings, I marked each of the trim pieces before cutting. For the most part, these appeared fairly uniform in length. I lightly sanded the edges, then allowed the tension to hold the trim until I was ready to glue. I tried to keep the edge of the trim flush to the back side of the dormer and have the extension raised above the surface on the front side. It will work better to have a completely flush surface on the back for the window to be mounted. Also, when the shingles are applied to the front, this provides a finished frame to butt up to the shingles. For the color of the shingles, I originally wanted to produce a weathered gray color. I went online to find a technique using vinegar and steel wool. The steel is dissolved into the vinegar, and the solution should chemically alter the wood to appear like old weathered shingles. I created the solution and left this to sit overnight before using. I tested this on some leftover shingle pieces that I had on hand. The result appeared darker and took on more of the rust tone from the steel. I tried some gray wash, but this looked even worse. Since I didn't hate the color produced by the steel wool and vinegar, I thought, well, it wasn't my original intention, but I'm going ahead with another happy accident. The small batch of solution was sufficient for all the shingles needed by the project. I would stain a sheet of shingles and leave this to dry overnight. The thin wood tends to curl from the moisture, but this is not too visible once the pieces are separated. When removing the shingles, they tend to splinter, so I would trim the frayed edges with scissors to maintain a clean edge. I used wood glue to apply the shingles to the surface of the foam board. This did appear to bond the shingles together well, but much later I noticed that the paper surface on the foam board did pull away slightly from the foam. I had to apply some additional glue to reattach the paper to the foam in a few areas. Before gluing the first row of shingles, I used some long pieces of sheet scrap along the bottom edge. This way, the white foam board would not be as visible between the joints. If I did this again, I would have used the black foam board, which would have made the gaps less obvious. The first row of shingles is then glued over the scrap and flush with the bottom edge. The next row is flush with the penciled line above. I had to trim the pieces around the windows and perimeter of the dormer. This can be accomplished with basic scissors. The glue tends to absorb into the wood, which causes it to curl and pull away from the surface. I used an iron wood file and other objects as weight to hold down the shingles while the glue set up. Since the front of the dormer will butt up to the side section, I allowed a slight overhang of the shingles along the side to cover the adjoining piece. For the side dormer pieces, I taped a small strip of foam board to the edge that substituted for the thickness of the front piece. The shingles need to be included that cover this area when connected. I glued the front, side, and bottom pieces together to create the dormer. I decided to cut a hole in the bottom of the dormer window so that light could pass through the window when the interior of the house was illuminated. I used the computer to determine the dormer placement. I read that the dormer mass should be in the center of the roof surface. The locations were transferred to the outer roof layer and the holes were cut. Due to slight variations of each dormer was assigned a hole and labeled to maintain control. The area on the back of the opening of the dormer was transferred to the structural roof surface and the holes were cut into the structural roof. If I had done better planning, I would have been able to place the roof supports in a location between the dormers. This is meant to be a model house and the windows will be darkened to make the flaw look less obvious. The dormer windows were created in the same manner as the regular house windows, but consist of a single pane group for the window. The frames consist of 2 layers of foam sheet, and the exterior frame is painted with the white gloss spray paint and the interior edge is touched up with craft paint. The window panes are printed on the transparencies and the mullions are painted with antique white. A window film is used to darken the window. The transparency is cut and glued to the back side of each dormer window. The window is then glued to the inside of the dormer. I used some weight to hold the window firm to the surface while the glue was drying. The dormer roof pieces were cut from the black foam core. Initially, I transferred the shingle guidelines from the house roof to the individual dormer roofs. However, I found later this did not align well and used a more on-the-fly approach when the time came. Each of the dormer roof panels was labeled to coordinate with a specific dormer. For each dormer roof, I installed a small support to mirror the front facade of the dormer. This made the structure more secure and kept the alignment in the correct location. This also let me know where to stop the roof shingling for the house roof. One side of the dormer roof is slightly longer than the other side and overlaps the other panel to form the peak. The drywall tape was glued to the joint to maintain the orientation of the panels. With the dormer roof in place, I marked the location of the bottom edge where the shingles would align to the house shingles. I used a perpendicular fixture to mark the location of the horizontal upper guideline for the row of roof shingles. The shingles were applied in the same manner as the roof shingles. Please see this video for further details. After painting the exposed edges, I applied a black wash, then a gray wash to be consistent with the finish on the house shingles. The dormers were glued into position on the roof, then the dormer roofs were attached. The foam board had some warping, so I used masking tape to hold the dormer roof into position while the glue was drying. A rug was placed over the top of the dormers to hold this snugly overnight. I tried a slightly different technique when applying the ridge cap shingles. The tiles were slightly creased with the X-Acto knife down the middle to allow for easy and uniform bending, and the tiles were overlapped by 1/4 of an inch to reveal 1/2 inch, just as the house roof. The difference was that I laid out the overlapping tiles on the flat work surface where one side was held together with tape. The tape side was glued together up to the crease. This will help keep the layout more uniform once the segment is glued to the dormer roof ridge. I kept the other half of the tiles unglued to allow flexibility when bending over the ridge. After the glue set, the segment was glued to the dormer roof. I used some small pieces of wood with a tape hinge to apply pressure. I used some cut-up pamphlets then to hold this down while the glue dried. The exposed foam tile edges were touched up with the black paint and finished with the gray wash. The last detail was the 3/8 inch foam strip that was tucked under the overhang of the dormer roof. Additional videos will cover the final assembly. Thanks for watching.